us for the 14th installment of our Geothink&Learn webinar series, this one on the Algorithmic City. I'm Sam Lumley, a Master's Researcher at the Department of Geography at McGill University with the Geothink Grant. So for those joining us for the first time, Geothink is a partnership grant funded by the Canadian Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. Along with 30 international partners and over 100 students, Geothink investigates how the GeoWeb is shaping government and citizen interactions. So I'm going to begin the session today by welcoming and introducing today's speakers. First of all, our convener for today's session is Geothink Head, Renee Sieber. Sieber is an associate professor at McGill University's Department of Geography and School of Environment, and is recognized worldwide for her research in public participation geographic information systems and the geospatial web 2.0, as well as community participation in use of new information and communications technologies. Our next panelist today is Bianca Wiley, an open government advocate with a dual background in technology and public engagement. She leads work on public sector technology policy for Canada at DGen Network and is a co-founder of Tech Reset Canada. Bianca is also a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation in the Global Economy Program. Next up, we have Nasma Ahmed, a technologist and community organizer that works with the intersection of social justice, technology, and policy. She is currently director of the Digital Justice Lab, an organization that focuses on building a more just and equitable digital future. And finally, we welcome Tracy Lore, an assistant professor of critical media and big data in the School of Journalism and Communication Studies at Carleton University. She's also a research associate with the Programmable City project and the Geomatics and Cartographic Research Center. So before we launch into the session, I'm going to go over a few ways attendees can interact with the webinar. First of all, the raise your hand feature allows you to notify the host that you want to share your video to ask a question. You'll need to accept the host's request to share your screen and unmute by clicking the microphone icon. The Q&A button on the top left will add a question to the queue, but not record you on the video. The Q&A button also has an anonymous feature if you prefer to use that. You can chat using the chat tab in the toolbar. Anyone using a mobile device can have the same, has the same functionalities as any other attendee, but please let us know if anything's not working for you. If you're dialing in using a telephone, you won't have the option to raise your hand or type in questions. However, you can ask questions with us via our Twitter, GeothinkCA. And just a final note that the entirety of the webinar will be recorded for future use and available at geothink.ca and on our YouTube channel. And with that, I will pass on to today's convener, Renee Sieber.
Hold on one moment. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. Welcome to my fabulous panelists today. I'm just going to go over a few basics and sort of lay the groundwork for what at least I think the algorithmic city is. So the algorithmic city, the computational city, the AI city lives in a lot of our imaginations. We certainly see it in science fiction with shows like Altered Carbon. It's also jurisdiction, whether that's urban or rural or regional. And it's a city that's increasingly managed by computation. And computation, which is coded rules that render the city efficient for us, for the private sector, and for the public sector as well. It's also a city that's geospatially aware, that's collecting a lot of data about us as we move in space-time, and this data is serving to further refine the algorithm. It's a place that knows where you are, what you want, and delivers it to you as quickly as possible. It's also a place, unfortunately, that is customized to prevent negative impacts to you. And those negative impacts might be potholes or a lack of parking spaces, or, as I'm sure we're going to cover later, a place where we don't have to interact with people that we don't want to. It's a place that lives in the public imagination via visualizations from architects. This is for the city of Brampton. So it's a place that's supposed to, via algorithms, allow us to predict urban change, to increase sustainability and reduce greenhouse gases, to streamline budgets, to alert citizens with real-time notifications, to create more humane and objective governance. So all good things are supposed to happen with the algorithmic city. So before we go further, just a couple of things about what the algorithmic city is. What's an algorithm? I mean, it's basically a set of rules. It's not meant to be very complicated. In fact, algorithms have existed before our current discussions about artificial intelligence. It's usually deployed in code. It's supposed to be, an intelligent machine that learns from humans. It learns from all the data that we're supplying it. It's supposed to imitate or even amplify a human. Think of the speculation that we will soon be interacting with the city via chatbots, so you won't even know if you're talking to an AI or not. It's supposed to perform tasks better than a human, more quickly, but also more objective and more politics free. So it's supposed to recognize existing patterns and replicate them. So why is that a problem? Why should we be worried? It sounds really great for us, right? Maybe not so much. First of all, these aren't the old rules that we had before. So I've got an automated car here. A car is a tool, but that car was not learning from us and was not replicating us. So here we've got the imagination of self-driving cars, where they're actually following our patterns of what we want them to do and what others like us or unlike us want how our cars should respond. Okay, so why the concern? Because when algorithms replicate our behavior, they also replicate our human frailties. They replicate our confirmation biases. A lot of these algorithms are trained on past data. They're trained to replicate the patterns that we already have. So if we have patterns that are biased, they are replicating our biases. If we have patterns that are biased and they're replicating our bias, they are confirming our biases. It's like, yes, we knew these were bad people all along, and the algorithms are just confirming to us via machines that they were bad all along. So they both reflect us and reinforce us. Why also the concern is that the machine is not always the best arbiter of politics. It confirms our biases. It's also supposed to be about anti-bias. It's supposed to be stripping the bias out. It's supposed to be more logical, less messy. And it defeats one of the fundamentals of politics, that it is necessarily messy. And we cannot necessarily look to technology for those kinds of solutions. And it also, disturbingly, allows for greater compliance via algorithm. So, you know, I'm sorry to the people out there who like, they don't want me to mention Foucault, but there is a French philosopher who often talked about the ways in which we'd no longer needed a police state to enforce compliance, and that we could push compliance all the way down into the way the algorithms and rules and norms govern us. Well, this is a very, very efficient way via algorithms to embed those norms deep into the software architecture of cities. So I leave you with these concerns, and hopefully we'll hear more about them with others. Thank you.
Thank you, Renee. And so next up we have Bianca Wiley.
Great, thanks, Renee. Hi, everybody. So I'm going to talk about two cases of procurement in the city. So thinking about the algorithmic city, but thinking about how cities, when they purchase software or tools, become the organization or the administration that starts to create these norms for people in cities. So the two cases that I'm going to talk about, one of them is called Safe TTC, and this is an app that the Toronto Transit Commission procured. And the other one I'm going to talk about is Sidewalk Labs, and some things that aren't they're plausible and haven't happened yet. So I'm trying to do a case study of something that already happened and some of the issues with something that may occur in Toronto right now. So for the first case, Safe TTC is an app that, I'm going to look at both these cases. Let's start with how they're sold, with how software may be sold to a city. So Safe TTC grabbed onto a concept that I think is getting very dated, and corporations are becoming aware as a problem, is maybe to sell things through safety. Because it's been a very explicit, blatant sell for the last 10 years at least, if not longer. And so the idea with this app that the TTC was selling, was purchasing and then selling to people to download for free, instructing residents in Toronto. It's an app to respond to harassment and other issues on the TTC. So this app came into Toronto as in response to reports around increased violence towards women in transit. And then there were other issues related to, people not feeling safe on the TTC. So the idea with this app is you download it, and then you are able to say you're having a problem, or someone's bothering you, or you see something, it's kind of like in airports, the signs, see something, say something. This idea, take a picture and send that photo or send a message to the TTC to sort of log an issue, and that this was going to be a way to resolve harassment, or to resolve issues where people didn't feel safe. And so I think, to pick up on this thing you said, Renee, perform tasks better than humans. So in this case, this is sort of this idea that if you insert some piece of technology between two humans, that you're gonna find a better way to resolve a problem. And so in this particular case, I think this is a great example of this being presented as though a $500,000 2-year investment in this app was good for the city to make on behalf of people that it wanted to keep safe on the TTC. Now, the option in our society and in our city that we then don't talk about is what could have happened if we would have had a $500,000 campaign, perhaps, or maybe not a campaign that had that high price tag, where you taught people to go up to, say you saw a woman who was being harassed, how you go up to a woman and can say, hey, nice to see you, how are you, it's been so long, and sort of teach people how you can do an intervention socially. This doesn't apply to all cases, of course, but there are human to human, non-technical solutions that may be things we should be thinking about. And this is, I'm presenting that as one example. There are others, but what happens is you start to create cultural norms around how to solve a problem. And I think this one presents a really good example of, problem, safety, solution, technical, cost, $500,000, and then very little discussion on the follow-up of how that has been implemented, where the data is going, who is being, targeted as a harasser more often, or what kind of situations are happening. So I wrote a few pieces which I can share on Twitter after about this particular app, but that's one because it explains how this was used in other cities and some of the issues with it. But what we don't then talk about is the other norm set that we could be developing, investing in, expanding, and, you know, human to human. And obviously in times where cities are under, you know, budgetary constraints, why aren't we thinking more about those? And why aren't we thinking more about things that increase human interaction and teach us how to resolve problems differently? So that's the Safe TTC case. In terms of sidewalk labs and the smart city, which is a very different kind of procurement, I think a lot of the issues that are rising out of the sidewalk labs project are born of a procurement that was just completely unruly, in that an RFP was issued for so it's, you know, the way the marketing language for this is to create a holistic take on a neighborhood. But what this really means is you've got one organization thinking about a whole bunch of different parts. And so I think interesting difference of language, it's not about creating a safe neighborhood in Toronto, it's creating a sustainable and resilient and vibrant neighborhood, right? So now we're using, I think this goes to show you the evolution of the language you use, because undoubtedly there are rooms where someone is pitching this as a safe thing, but I think there's becoming an awareness that that plays well with some and maybe not well with others. So I think there's a bit of an evolution in the rhetoric of this stuff. In terms of the Sidewalk Labs case, there are so many different pieces that are being procured. I want to really hone in on another norm that I think is problematic with the sidewalk one, which is, you know, this project was pitched as a neighborhood built from the internet up. And only recently has there been more details around, you know, what that means and what does it mean to have local, you know, local network connectivity that may be more secure, for example. So if you're in a local neighborhood, the example that Sidewalk used was that they're bringing forward protocol and ideas for internet connectivity that would say, let you check in on your dog when you're out of the house. Now, here's what's interesting in there. What is very softly sold in there is the concept that a smart home is a normal thing. And so I think while we may be looking at the technical infrastructure that may be providing safer or more secure connectivity, inherent in that discussion is the idea that smart homes is a thing that societally should become normal. I don't think they should become normal. And I think that there's a lot of implications around, you know, networked smart homes that we should be having conversations about, but nothing in this procurement, particularly when it's just presented as sort of a neutral, better connectivity discussion, brings us into the conversation about smart homes and what smart homes mean for the people living in them and what that means for a neighborhood. And so I think that's an example of almost like by not talking directly about the app or about the product, you skip the way bigger framing conversation that maybe should be had. So our smart cities now normalizing smart home technology, which is a completely different product and services set, but isn't really landing in the Sidewalk Toronto discussion. As we know, part of the Alphabet suite includes a lot of smart home products. So that's one of those cases where are we having the right conversation and what may be being enabled as a social norm. And I don't think we're having the right conversations, but this is all happening within the scope of something called procurement. So that case, I think we're thinking also when something is not sold in a defined way, you create plausible infrastructures and plausible options for how the future might work simply by embedding them in physical spaces. So that's challenging and very different from the Safe TTC. I'm going to wrap up with just a little bonus example as someone who's worked with open data for years and sometimes wonders, you know, how that lands in the algorithmic city. Mark Richardson has been working with a group of people on something called Housing Now Toronto. And this is a little sheet that he shared with me recently. And this is a really interesting example of data as accountability. He took staff reports and tons of disparate data and put it in one place as a way to start holding politicians accountable regarding affordable housing claims. And I think this goes to show you that there are definitely places where publishing data about the city makes sense, but this is administrative data and this is data regarding plans and governments and openness and accountability. So I think that there are places that there are good examples of data being used in the city, but they may not be specific to the physicality of the city. They may be describing the city and its policies. So check that thing out, Housing Now Toronto. And thanks, Mark, nice work. And thanks everybody, that's me.
Thanks very much, Bianca. Perhaps you could share some of those links in the chat as we go, if you're able to.
Yeah.
So next up, we have Nasma Ahmed.
Hi, everybody. So thank you, Bianca, for showing some examples, because I too have examples, and a lot of our examples, at least for me, are in the context of Toronto. And when I think about algorithmic cities, I do think about James Baldwin's quote, "Do I really want to be integrated into a burning house?" And the reason why I provide that quote is, as you know, data is consistently collected in every movement that we make in a city. How do we think about tech solutions that come with that, that we may not know the bias that's tied to it, the ethical situation around it, the procurement process. There's so much that's up in the air that we can't touch, feel, or see. And that I think about James Baldwin's quote a lot as I think about smart city developments and what we're moving towards. And, you know, most of my conversations and how I think about algorithmic cities is how much do we have to know to make an informed decision about, as citizens or as residents in an area, about the data that is collected. Because as we know, a lot people do say, right, like, it's important to know that there is data that's continuously collected, for example, traffic data, right? So how do we think about the usage, and how do we think about what is okay and not okay for us as residents? And do we have the policy within the city to actually protect us, and, you know, be able to say no if it's not working, right? And that's actually all up in the air. And so there's a lot of the lack of decision making on the, you know, in regards to a resident living in an area, or even the visitors that are coming into the area. I think about that often when I'm visiting new places, and I'm like, I actually don't know what's being collected as I walk around, right? So I'm going to provide kind of two major examples of how we're seeing technology solutions being posed in the city context. So one of the, I guess, more infamous examples last year in Toronto was the recommendation to have ShotSpotter. ShotSpotter is a US-based microphone surveillance system. Essentially what it does is the technology, when you hear a shotgun, records up to like 4 to 8 seconds after, and then in about 45 seconds provides a location. This was actually proposed after the, I'm going to do quotes, the summer of violence that was posed by the city. And, you know, essentially the mayor was looking into investing in programs and services, but part of that was thinking about a technology solution. And ShotSpotter had been fairly successful in getting cities to procure their services across the United States. And, you know, obviously against the civil society organizations who have shared their concerns around this technology, which, by the way, is often placed in low-income, poor neighborhoods in a city. And, you know, ShotSpotter, actually, the investment was $4 million. That was the proposed investment for ShotSpotter, and also an increased investment in CCTV cameras. So from 34 to 77 CCTV cameras. And so, you know, what's important to think about in regards to this context is there's a lot of other things, right? The $4 million could easily have gone into youth programming. It could have gone into community supports that have been asked and requested by organizations. And it really ties back, you know, again, to like the safe city, right? Like using safety as a way of implementing technology. And, you know, funny enough, thankfully enough, the last couple of weeks we found out that ShotSpotter will not be implemented because of privacy concerns. And so, you know, yay for that, and yay for the fact that people had really been trying to fight it really hard, especially because it was tied to safety, right? So it was very hard to say that, you know, that tool should not be used, especially after the amount of violence that happened over the summertime, where, you know, and also tied to anti-Blackness in the city. And so I think about that example, and I also think about the Metrolinx example of data collected with Metrolinx Presto card. And so, you know, Toronto is going through, I'd say it was a revitalization of their transit system and the ways in which you access transit. And part of that is through a Presto card. And what we're seeing now for the first time is that every tap you make your travel is being, like data is being collected on your travel, right? So if you're going from, you know, one station to another, the time also between that is all collected. And there was a lot of reports that came out of the fact that Metrolinx was sharing data with the police without actually having a warrant to do so. And you almost see how something like this, like for example, the data that's collected at every point of your transportation, and the fact that you might not actually even know where that data is going, where it's, you know, Metrolinx has been fairly unclear about their deletion policy, if they have that. And so you see that almost our everyday kind of experiences of accessing transit. And if you're thinking about who accesses transit the most, which is, you know, low income, poor folks who, or equity seeking folks who are traveling far, and now they have to participate in this massive data collection that's happening, right? And so, you know, I once again constantly think about how much do we have to know to make an informed decision? And I don't think any of this is inevitable, right? I do think that there is a way that, for example, around Metrolinx, that we can request that data is deleted or that it's actually not collected at all, right? Unless it's for certain usage. Clearly right now, we can't dictate the usage because police can access it without a warrant. And so that's, you know, important to think about as we move forward. I do think that we are constantly finding ways to build tech solutions to avoid responsibility. I think that's one of the biggest pieces, is that it avoids, it's almost as Renee was talking about, it's supposed to remove bias, but actually replicates the bias. It's supposed to be ethical, but, you know, now we don't have a human to talk about, right? To talk to or to engage with. And so I think a lot is removed from our decision-making powers and our agency as we engage in city building. And so as we move forward, I do not think that these things are inevitable. I do think it's important to think about the fact that cities, city building is inherently racist, right? It's important to think about the power dynamics that connect, you know, the usage of technology as solutions, you know, the ways in which cities operate at the moment as we're pushing towards a smarter, quote unquote, smarter city, and who's pushing those conversations and making cities feel that they have to do all these fun, cool stuff, right, to build a more innovative and efficient city. I don't necessarily need an efficient city. I need a just city. I need an equitable city. I need a city that's affordable. And I do think that as we are moving forward, as we think about cities, it's going to be more important for us to think about our decision-making power and our agency as residents in an area around the tools that are used, but also other developments such as Sidewalk Labs, which, you know, poses a perfect example of crappy processes, right, and undemocratic processes that remove our agency as residents. And so I don't think any of this is inevitable. And the biggest thing that we can think about moving forward and collectively is how much do we have to know to make a meaningful decision, and how can we build capacity with a broader audience to be able to engage in these conversations? Because at the moment, a lot of the conversations are at a very expert level, and there is a role for all of us to play in engaging people in meaningful ways. That's where I'm at.
Thanks very much, Nazma. So our final speaker today for our Q&A is Tracy Lore.
Thanks, Nazma, for the just, fair, and transparent and accountable smart city or algorithmic city. So in a way, the future is already here, because there are already many, many examples of algorithmic cities or elements of algorithmic cities, or where we use machine learning or where we use artificial intelligence. So a little homage to science fiction there for Renee, who started us off. So if we think of traffic, we already have fleet management systems. We already have transit management systems. We have Presto, which is already part of algorithmically managing, monitoring, and sorting people who travel here and there. We have, wouldn't it be great if we had traffic management systems for school buses, where the school buses would actually pick up people in the right place at the right time, get them to the right school system, take the best route, and not such a divided bunch of systems. We already have location-based services with traffic management systems, and location-based services are in everybody's pocket, well, everybody's pocket pocket who has a phone or who has a wearable, for instance. And so therefore, we're already connected with providing all kinds of data about our different types of behavior. It's already, when it comes back to traffic, we already have autonomous vehicles and autonomous fleets where we're looking at all kinds of sometimes machine learning and sometimes of artificial intelligence in these types of systems, but actually mostly semi-supervised types of systems that are already operating and being tested around the world. But then there's also really interesting projects like Vision Zero, where we're looking at, well, how can we have social and technical algorithmic type of transportation system, where there would be a focus on multimodal transportation and where the design, overarching design principle would be no death. So first you start with no death, and the responsibility lies with the designers and the engineers, and not the sole responsibility of the person who gets into an accident. So the blame is actually shifted to those who make the system and design the system, and it's up to them to design the system to be more accountable, more transparent, and to avoid accidents and to prevent accidents. And this is already happening. We're already seeing this kind of work happening in the context of Sweden, for example. But it's not just a technical system, it's also one where, you know, yes, maybe like in cities like Gothenburg, there's a chip in your car, and there's a toll if you go into the city from outside the city, you must pay it because they're trying to reduce traffic in the city, which is a great thing. But it's also a way of saying that maybe we're going to learn how traffic and the diurnal patterns of traffic in a day happen, and we'll try and make traffic move more efficiently. But just because all the lights are green doesn't mean you get to speed. And because of that chip in your car, it actually controls speeding, and tickets are prorated to your salary. So it's not just a technical system, it's a social system, and it's a technical system, and it's an integrated system, and it's an engineering system in terms of physical engineering of the roads and the systems that go into it. We also already have banking and transaction type of algorithmic aspects of the city. So we think of our credit scores, we think of fraud detection, we think of just taxation, you know, when we file with CRA, and we think of fintech in general. That's already alive and well in our cities. The unfortunate side of a lot of that is the integration with the data brokerage firms. So those data are not very well controlled. They are sold and bought by third-party institutions, by a type of entity, data brokerage firm and financial technology types of firms that are not very well regulated, and that is something clearly that we need to start having discussions about. Our utilities are already algorithmic. We manage our water systems this way, and we manage our grid system this way. And if you take a look at your electrical bill, you will start seeing it's not only when you use energy at different parts of the day, but which devices in your house are using and consuming energy at any given time of day. And, you know, the environmentalist in me would have lobbied for this kind of information, because it would have meant maybe I will modify my behavior as a result of what I see on my bill. But the other side, you know, the privacy advocate and the person concerned with mission creep that Renee brought up a little bit earlier, is this idea that every second of your day can be monitored by a utility, and how they use those data and how they resell those data and how they repurpose those data are not very well defined. Fortunately, in Ontario, we have quite a good system, but we haven't seen how this smart grid third-party reuse and resale of these data can be used. And we haven't decided how we're going to monitor, you know, the finesse of how, you know, the time lapses between the data capture and the use and the rebroadcasting of those data. We already have document artificial intelligence. Our passports, the UK passport system, for instance, the new biometric passport system, you apply online, you get adjudicated online, especially for those where the decision-making process is very clear. You have all the right documents in place, all the right scans in place, all the right photos, et cetera, in place, and then the decision gets made and you can go and pick up your passport. It's not so clear with how it works with people who are not straightforward normal cases, and how those decisions get made and how they get overseen. But we can think of all of our registry systems, for instance, they're all automated. So birth certificates, death certificates, all of those kinds of things, you go online, you fill them out, and that's an automated system, and that's happening in the city. How you apply for licenses, that is all automated in the city, and so on. Again, what happens with those document systems? What happens with banking and transaction systems? How are those things integrated with each other? and how are those things governed, who owns those types of systems, and to bring up what Bianca was talking about, how are they procured in terms of ownership and third-party resale and control and management of those data. We already have, as I said earlier, location-based management systems. So all of our phones, right, they're pinging to different towers. That's all algorithmically derived. Cars, and of course, all of our wearables are very much, and wearables, that's from your phone to your Fitbit and so on. Again, that's a relationship between you and a private sector corporation. What happens when the cat is out of the box and those systems start getting integrated and the data from those things starting getting resold, and you're being nudged into normative types of behaviors that don't necessarily always make sense. And nobody told us how 10,000 steps became the norm, for instance. It just suddenly, that is something that we have to achieve. And is that really a perfect norm for everyone else in terms of bodily control and so on? So that's more on the behavioral data side of the equation. But the good thing and the difficult thing right now is that none of these things that I just listed, many of which are benign and some of which are less benign than others, are integrated. They're all spotty, and each city has them operating in different ways. They're also multisectoral, primarily leaning towards the private sector. They're also multi-jurisdictional. You think of the grid is run by the province, but we consume electricity in the home, and the location, the local distribution network happens at the city level. So how do we govern these things, and how do we have the jurisdiction over these things? So the fact that they're not integrated is a good thing at this time. It affords us the opportunity to have conversations about how we want these things to be governed. How do we want these things to be ruled? And which areas should there be tremendous amounts of caution, particularly when it comes to health services and it comes to social services, where we're starting to see, or educational monitoring services within our kids' schools. How do we deal with those kinds of algorithmic parts of our cities? And how do we not move towards necessarily, you know, the social physics model of the sensing, perfectly integrated, efficient, et cetera, city? And how do we move more to what, you know, the problem that NASMA has brought forward for us is the more fair, accountable, and transparent city. So overall, I think what we need, and this is something that I've had in conversation with Bianca, is I think we need to have social and technical impact assessments in our cities, much like environmental impact assessment and social impact assessment at the moment. That is one way. And I think another way that affords us a really interesting time is we can start identifying what these systems are, where they are, and how are they deployed. We can start identifying from a social and technological perspective where the issues are, and then we can start having educated collective conversations on how we can improve these kinds of systems. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tracy. So I'll just remind, so that's it from our panelists, but we can now open the session up to Q&A. So just a reminder to any attendees, you can ask any questions you like through the Q&A button. If you prefer to ask anonymously, there should be a little tick box that you can tick, so you can do that too. So to start off, I think I'm going to ask a reply that I've heard quite a lot from different people, which is that, so talking about data privacy and talking about having these conversations about social impacts, someone might say that, you know, I'm not doing anything wrong, so why should I care about my data being used? So I was wondering if you'd be able to discuss how you might answer that question in relation to algorithmic cities, and this can go to any panelists. Tracy.
Well, we heard this with the environmental movement. So the environmental movement said, well, we're not polluting, so why do we need an environmental impact assessment? And hey, large dams are good for the environment, they're better than nuclear power, yet most large dams are built in Indigenous communities in Canada, and there's a lot of disruption for wildlife, for nature, and so on. So that's a very old type of thinking, and it's also a very old question that we hear over and over again. And what we also know, if we just look at the history of the study of technology, that we don't know what the implications are down the road, and that we ought to be thinking of what the implications of the deployment of these technologies are. And we can't do that unless we have some kind of assessment protocol in place at the time, and I think Bianca was quite right, at the time of procurement. But also we need to step back before then and start thinking of, well, we already have all of these instances of AI in our cities. What are the issues that we have with these particular AIs at the moment? And what do we need to do when we start having more integrative and systems thinking, and how do we start thinking of, you know, technical creep, technological momentum, mission creep, and so on and so forth with these types of devices. So I think we need some kind of ethical principles and guidelines to inform our decision making, and that would form part of, I think, of a social and technical impact assessment.
I'll take a crack at it as well, because as Tracy says, this question comes up over and over again. So I want to question one of the premises of these questions, and I think it has to do with laws versus norms. A lot of people think they've done nothing wrong because they haven't violated a law, but they have violated a norm. So I pointed out in one of the answers to the questions, you know, think about your search history, and aren't there things you wouldn't want revealed in your search history? But I'm not sure that convinces people, because for two reasons. One, because they see that as a norm, not a law, so they haven't broken the law. Second of all, it's okay if it's about me, but it's not okay if it's about that other person. So I think we need to look at, first of all, this distinction between, are you actually breaking a norm, a cultural norm, as Bianca was referring to, and not a law, and how that can be problematic, and how the norm can be translated into, you know, like, I'm thinking about Sesame, the social credit system in China, how things can be denied to you on the basis of you're breaking a norm, and whether or not the norms you have are culturally and racially dependent. So you think it's okay for you, but not okay for somebody else.
Thanks. And just building on that, do you think and again, this can go to any panelist, how quickly do we need to update the legal system? It sounds like there are a lot of kind of pieces that haven't been fully incorporated into laws yet. So how quickly do we need to update the legal system? Bianca, you want to take this one?
Yeah, not quickly. I think the answer to that one, yeah, for me is not quickly, because to zoom back out of these conversations, we haven't had good conversations about these conversations. We haven't had discussions where we've unpacked some of the normative, you know, assumed normative goods, or the like, well, this is status quo, so this has to be how it goes into the future. And I think to a lot of Nasma's points, if you don't start to present alternatives or different futures, it's really hard to imagine that your legislation may just mitigate, like it may not be supportive of like a truly different and constructive sort of law. So I think but I think what's important about this too is that law is but one of many things, right? So you have laws, you have policies, you can have standards, you can have ways to manage some of these issues that you can do quickly, and then do some things that require a lot of conversation, so that when you do them right. So I think that's the other piece of that, is that there are definite like crises happening in some of the uses of data and what's happening in cities, and law is not the answer, but maybe it's around, you know, even I think one thing that we don't think about enough is the option to just not do something, to just not procure perhaps, or to just, you know, like that's always an option. And so you have to think through all those different options and think, how do you address some of these things while we hold space and time to have discussions again about Nesma's, you know, what she talked about so much, is what else could, you know, the future look like, and how do we make sure that we have space to have public and public buy-in for that, and also social license. Because I think it's so difficult right now to imagine something else, because things are presented as this is the future, and if you're not with it, you're a stick in the mud, you're not innovative, you're slow, these things. So that's a strong force to push back against that, to say technology is not normative good, or that technology, that this technology is not the only future. And I think to Renee's point there, like those are more around norms. Like this is where culture is so important and strong, and how do we have language and rhetoric and create opportunity, and this is where the arts comes into play, right? And where I love Renee, he started with science fiction, right? Like that's kind of one of the ways to start thinking about other things. But I think I'll close on the point that I think Tracy's idea of that assessment is so important, and it's one of those things that let's do a law, sort of let's make a legislative kind of set of things that we're not starting the law from zero. Perhaps we're taking something where there's a law for one case, how do we maybe transform it, or so we're not going from zero, so that we can do law that we can do relatively fast, but not overnight, but building on things for different contexts. So I think going to the environmental cases is a really great place, because it's one of those places where we're not doing a good job right now of understanding collective harm and how one thing impacts a whole bunch of other things. So again, environment seems to me a great model for that. So I love that idea, Tracy. Like I think that's such a powerful kind of medium-term solution.
Thanks, Bianca. Oh, sorry, Nesbitt, did you want to add there?
No, I was gonna say there's a really good question here around, for what is next and what is like a role of, for example, someone who works in a city. And I think that's a really interesting one that I think we all get probably asked a lot, is like, what is possible and who is responsible? So I would love to kind of hear people's thoughts on that. I can provide my quick input, that I find that thinking about impact assessments is like one first level of thinking about what's possible and like usage. I do notice that from my work as well is that we don't actually often ask public servants what they want to see for the future of cities, right? Because there is like, you live in the city most of the time that you're working in, and so there is a lot that people do think around privacy, around data collection, around data usage that is actually inherent within the public service, right, and within the employees that work at the city that help run this wonderful city that we live in, and help support running the wonderful city. And so I think the biggest thing is thinking about impact assessments. I think another thing is thinking about your values. I know it sounds fluffy, but I actually think that's one of the biggest things for me, is that if you are values and principle driven, right, you're allowed to then think about what the next policy situation is, or what project you won't sign on. A really good example is like franchising agreements, right? Some people shape franchising agreements in a city to include the privacy policy, right? Because they want to dictate what the privacy policy is, right? So I think that there are ample opportunities. And I think a lot of it actually starts with like folks have been talking within, right? Within their own teams. And then from there, being able to bring people to support you in that process. But, I don't think there is any cut and dry way of doing it. I think it all is just based on the city and their own, bureaucracy. But I do think thinking about principles and values, and then from there, figuring out what the possibilities are is a good step moving forward. And also thinking about the fact that, you can't stop everything, but there are things that can be done on a small scale, right? So, but Tracy has something to say.
So part of that has been worked out a little bit in the Open Smart Cities project, right? The Open Smart Cities project is about fair, accountable, and transparent cities that are sustainable, just, and economically viable. So it's this idea that we have these high order thinking principles of what should be governing. And then what we did is we went around the world looking at multiple examples of where those things existed, whether it have been procurement, whether it be related to environment, whether it be related to technologies that are not made with slave labor, whether it be digital rights management, whether it be looking at the classification systems, whether it be looking at the underlying infrastructure of the system and whether or not that should be open or not, how that is going to be governed and who is going to govern govern that? How do we have public engagement with these types of systems? So I sent the link to the chat for everyone. But the thing that's useful about that document is it's a starter kit. It's not the end. It's only the beginning of the conversation of the many possibilities that we have. Vision Zero was another example of one where, you know, blame gets shifted to another level or another level of design of a system. Yes, it's for all of us, but is it really for all of us, and how? So I think those principles are articulated there. Now what I think the work that needs to be done on this is we need to take the algorithmic route and follow that all the way through. We also need to look at the more legal route and follow that all the way through. We need to look at the public engagement piece and follow all that way through. And we need to start figuring out ways that we're going to have that more systems thinking in how we go about dealing with these things, and not like we have now. We have the balkanized algorithmic city that currently exists. We know these things are going to be integrated, so now is time for us to start convening governance structures so that we can start addressing these things.
Thanks. And I'm just going to, oh, sorry, Bianca, do you want to add to that?
Did you like my confusing hand? I'm like, am I putting my hand up? I'm not sure. Yes, I am. Interesting, you know, to Nasma's point about the, you know, the administration, or, you know, the public service in all cases, it feels like a good time for human resources to push itself right to the front of the table in almost every organization, including, I think, the public service, to start to think about what the implications are on the role of the public servant when they are being handed things that they may not have a hand in purchasing necessarily, and to start to think about how does transformation look, you know, from a labor perspective within government. And I think that also touches on this, you know, one of the most powerful but rather kind of sitting powers right now is the public sector unions. And so thinking about who has weight to throw around in terms of, you know, near-term changes or requests or demands or whatever it may be around how, you know, on how technology is implemented, whether it's in someone's job or within, you know, the area or the jurisdiction that they're responsible for, feels like a really interesting opportunity, you know, like to engage a different set of people and to try to work through a different channel, because I think the historical implication of IT being in charge of the algorithmic city is problematic, because it's way too, you know, it's just like, it's a layer that hasn't evolved much when you compare its previous functions. You know, you look at different levels of government, and when IT was, you know, my email's not working, and that was the function of IT, and now IT is being engaged in things that are completely different and affect the whole institution of government, which is both good but also hard. So how do you think about that transformation and maybe working more through human resources?
Let me reach to science fiction. I don't think that it is by accident that most algorithmic cities are dystopic. We often don't see a utopia of efficiency unless you look at somebody far back as B.F. Skinner. Algorithmic cities are places that are sterile. They are places that serve the 0.001%. They are places of perversion and violence. Now, we could argue that this is the limited imagination of science fiction authors and that alternatives are possible, but it is not by accident that we don't talk about the creative futuristic city when we also talk about the intersection of that city with computation.
I think that referencing back to science fiction, I do think it's important to understand the role of the corporate sector in this, right? In pushing a lot of the efficiency conversations, right? That we need to be faster, that we move faster, that we break faster, that we need to innovate, right? I think it's important to always like think back to that. And I think about Octavia Butler, who is also a black sci-fi writer. And, you know, in her book, Parable of Sorrow, she talks about this quote that I'm going to think you should all think about is, cities controlled by big companies are old hat in science fiction. My grandmother left a whole bookcase of old science fiction novels. The company city subgenre always seemed to star a hero who outsmarted, overthrew, or escaped the company. I've never seen one where the hero fought like hell to get taken in and underpaid by the company. In real life, that's the way it will be. That's the way it always is. And so thinking about just also the role of the corporatization, right, as we move forward is really important, because that's maybe why a lot of us feel constantly rushed in this process.
Yeah, I also want to push back against well, it's going to be done anyway, so why are we having this conversation? If cities don't do it, then you know, we're going to be swamped by China or another nation state, or the private sector is going to be collecting all this data about us anyway. I think this is the start of many, many conversations that we need to have. It is both a done deal that we have algorithms, and it is not a done deal in terms of how we respectfully respond to the intrusion of algorithms in our daily lives. So this is the beginning of an incredibly long conversation that's going to be really nuanced and is going to be contextual. It's going to differ by the city that we're talking about. And I'll also like to mention that one of the challenges for Canadian cities, if you think about things like ShotSpotter, is they're coming from American places. And it's not that we don't love our American colleagues, but we are living in a different, we have different governance here. And we have to think very critically about algorithms and technologies that are trained on US examples.
Bianca, do you want to?
Tracy first.
Okay.
So I think we also need to begin imagining what we want, right? I spent, a huge chunk of my life as an environmental activist, as an indigenous rights activist, as a social justice activist, and and an anti-nuclear activist, and almost everything we did was an anti-movement. It was against something. And we'd get really tired and really burnt out, and we lost most of the battles, as we can see how most things are at the moment. Nonetheless, what happened was, because we were so focused on the no, we never got to focus on the roadmap towards improving things. And I've decided, I've got, maybe 20 years left of really serious intellectual capacity in me. And so as a result of that, I've decided that I'm going to try and focus on what we might want. And I'm going to look at examples of things that we might see in other places that we like, that we might be able to appropriate and bring here, and or examples from social justice groups, community-based organizations, groups like Tech Reset, and the work that you're doing with Digital Data Justice Lab, NASMA, and so on, where we can start infusing these social, and we forget the social and the technical, but these social and technological systems, we need to infuse them with different values and different ethics and different values, and we need to decide what we want and not exclusively focus on what we don't want. I think would be some way where we might be able to get some positive change, and we might be able to steer the course of traffic in a way that's going to be more beneficial to us in the long run.
Two quick points touching on things two of you said. Renee, to your point about the American values informing things. So I'm just going to share this thing with SafeTTC where I hit a wall in I didn't know what to do with my problem, was that when I tracked the product back, I found it was an American company. I found the American company specialized in safety in schools, emergency messaging alerts for when there's shootings, like the product range kind of blew my mind. And I hit that company had a banner to support police officers in schools. This was at the exact same time in Toronto, the discussion was get the police officers out of schools. And so I kind of sat there thinking, in a procurement model, like money from the city of Toronto, the TTC, was going to this company who was then sponsoring that kind of political activity, and not even in Canada. And like something in there got really messy, and I started to think, you know, bringing values into procurement, values is for me such a, you know, that I don't even know where to go with that one. But there was something in there where I didn't, you know, you can imagine you could turn this a different way. Like you can't make that the reason that you don't buy something, but there was something heavily problematic in the supply chain when I went up a few levels, and I thought, okay, well, this is not something that my money as a resident in Toronto, and I rarely pull out the my money thing, but there is something to say about what the dollars of the people in this country, when they purchase things, influences another country's politics, because you inherently even support that thing going on over there, right? Which is purchasing. We see this globally. The second quick thing, just to jump on what Nesma was saying about the private sector, with this agility of product, right? Like with this idea that like we're agile, we're trying things. This is very much in the Sidewalk Labs discourse, is that it's like, it's never bad enough because there's never a line. Like the product's never done, right? So this is software, this is this, somehow someone thought it was okay to be constantly changing and agile. Well, we're gonna respond, we'll have a different release and blah, 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 we'll fix that. Thank you for your input. But there's never a line. Like there is never a line by design in those kinds of things. And I always think about these procurements we've had where bad behavior gets rewarded because it's the bad actor that knows, you know, who else knows the problem the way that the bad actor does. And so you get into this stuff where there's never a point in an agile, ongoing, iterative cycle to stop something. So I think like that's where the way that corporate language is starting to influence everything. And I mean, I myself have advocated for some agility in certain areas, like sure, but this becomes really problematic when there's no line anymore. So I think that those things connected to me in terms of how this corporate lingo is sort of seeping into decisions that affect us in the city in that way.
Thanks. So I'll just, if I can, raise one last kind of big question, an interesting comment that one of our attendees made. I think we've talked a lot about the challenges, very severe challenges that the Algorithmic City brings with it. But are there ways that the tech could be used to bring about a fairer, can we reimagine an Algorithmic City to bring about those positive social changes that we desire? Tracy, would you like to?
Well, I brought up quite a few examples early on. So Vision Zero is one when it comes to transportation. You know, air quality is another. You know, I mean, we are already measuring and monitoring air quality. We could do so a little bit better and a little more efficiently in a more distributed way. We could also be using it to better monitor, manage, and share information about our consumption patterns. You know, we really don't know how much on any given time of day, how much we're recycling, we're not recycling, how much we're consuming. So it certainly could be related to those types of issues. It's certainly any kind of environmental stuff, managing the trees of the city, for instance, and making sure that they're water. I mean, there's all kinds of really interesting things where, you know, we could be using algorithms to understand where we could practice urban agriculture and rooftop gardening by looking at variables, you know, where's the hose, where's the distance from, you know, exhaust fumes and the proximity to walking in communities. I mean, there's so many. What is it, where and how should we have affordable housing? And what does that look like? And what do we need to change and tweak in the economy and the incentive systems and the mortgage systems and the banking systems and the land use and access systems? You know, how would we model that and tweak that a little bit so that we can actually afford affordable housing? We can, we just choose not to at the moment with the current system that we have. Those are all things that we can dedicate our efforts towards if we choose to. The issue is it takes a little bit of time to develop these types of integrated systems, but they're all possibilities. I think Vision Zero is a fantastic example of where that occurs. And you can go take a look at the city of Gothenburg. They've reduced traffic, they've increased multimodal, they've controlled speeds, but they've also reduced frustration, and they're maintaining their roads in a much better way. And they're designing better all the time because they're learning all the time based on the system that they have. These things are possible. It's just that we're not implementing those kinds of things in a systemic way yet. And those are not the decisions we're making. We're making decisions to control people, police people, survey people, nudge people, make people shop. but we could also have much larger systemic systems that help us consume, produce, move, and think, and have recreation differently in the city. So I think there's so many interesting opportunities that we could do this. It's just a matter of us putting our thinking caps on and looking at what they could be.
So I would go into the software architecture and I would ask the companies supplying these algorithms about what metrics they choose to tune their output. I mentioned this in one of the answers. So much of the algorithms we have are tuned towards performance in terms of the speed at which the algorithm operates. And also they are tuned by Pareto optimization. In other words, the greatest good for the greatest number. But we may not want the greatest good for the greatest number. In fact, to Nazma's point, I believe, I don't want an efficient city. I want a just city. I want an effective city. Cities in many parts of governance are highly inefficient, and they need to be highly inefficient because you think about places in Quebec, like the Gaspésie, like the North. It is highly inefficient to have anybody there. But we choose as a just society to allow people to remain there. We have Indigenous people scattered in very remote places in Canada. Why shouldn't we just move them to cities? But we choose as a society to respect the land and to respect where they choose to live. That is inefficient. So we should be building metrics that evaluate these algorithms on the basis of rights and not how many people are served. And I would point you to yet another science fiction book called The Thing Itself by Adam Roberts, which is about a Kantian AI, where most all of our other AIs are consequentialist.
Okay, thanks very much, everyone. So sadly, we've just about reached our time. So I'll take this opportunity to extend a very warm thank you to all our panelists for their contributions and time and energy.
Can we get Bianca in?
Yes, sure.
I'll go really fast just because I feel like
last thoughts.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I have to go really fast because I think we need to be so careful that we're not twiddling at the edges when the core of these problems is to fund them, because I would take all the technology in the world and put it not in the sea, because that wouldn't be good for the sea, but I would skip it all if it was to mean that things were properly funded. And so I think we have to be really careful that we're not worrying so much about twiddly edge justice and really avoiding the political action for direct justice like this. And I think it's incumbent upon everybody in the technology community to kind of lead with that thinking when they do their work. Otherwise, they're giving themselves this importance so that they can accomplish things at the edge when they can't. So we got to be small if we're going to be in the tech, I think everything that needs to be known as small, not large. And politically, it's money, not tech, money.
And not to look to the companies themselves to build ethics. They can, but we need to be driving the conversation about what's ethical.
So Nazma, if you had any last thoughts too, feel free to.
I think it's important to, as Renee was saying, not let the companies shape the policy. I think that was one of the bigger issues around the sidewalk lab situation, is that part of their proposal was to help support building policy. And so I think that's important to think about moving forward. And also how we build up public education around this work, because it's not just public education with residents, but also with policymakers, because it is really complex, and it's actually in many ways posed to be that way, right? It makes you feel like you can't touch it, that you need only a technologist expert or a futurist to help you navigate it. But I think a lot of people have their own expertise that tie very well into the work that's being done around technology. So I think part of it is us creating that space for translation, and creating the space for the fact that it's, in the grand scheme of things, it's not it's like complex, but it's not the worst case scenario. You know what's like super complex to me? Like racist structures, you know what I mean? So I think it's important for us to like recognize that it is possible to engage, and that you don't need to know a whole bunch to understand, right, the levels of power, to understand the ways in which it operates in a city context. And so yeah, I think it's giving yourself the freedom to just learn as much as you can, but in many ways it's posed to be very difficult so that people don't engage.
Okay, thanks so much to everyone, to all our panelists. Sorry to break off the conversation at such an interesting juncture. Thanks also to our attendees for joining us and for contributing to the discussion as well. I'll just give a reminder that today's session was recorded. So if you have friends or colleagues that were unable to make it along today, the full video will be uploaded to our website and our YouTube channel. The full chat should be there too. So if there's any links that our panelists have submitted, then they should be there too. And so with that, I'd like to turn to our convener, Renee Sieber, for her final thoughts.
Besides creating a conversation with science fiction authors, and thankfully, unlike the 1930s and the 1940s science fiction, we have much broader visions of science fiction futures than we used to. I'd just like to thank all the panelists. I think we could go on for hours and hours about this subject, and I look forward to many more conversations with all of the panelists. And drop us a line, people who participated. If you have questions, we'd love to continue the conversation.
Thanks once more for everyone who's joined us. Have a good day.